The pre-dawn silence was broken by the sound of the giant warehouse doors opening. As soon as the doors were fully opened, the driver steered his large truck inside. The driver, Corporal Timothy Dennings, was just about to shift into a higher gear and hit the gas when suddenly a figure appeared in front of his truck. Dennings rolled down the window as the figure approached the driver's side. "Get out of this truck so I can talk to you, boy," the figure shouted, craning his neck to see Dennings. Dennings jumped to the ground and still towered high above the figure. His heartbeat was so loud that he was sure the man could hear it. His worst nightmare had just come true. The little man in front of him was the scourge of all military trucks. Master Sergeant Donald Docherty was the man in charge of everything that came out of or into the warehouse. "What are you trying to take from my base?" asked Docherty with contempt. Docherty, standing just 5 ft 2 in, was an imposing figure despite his small stature. He also had a funny voice, which earned him the nickname Donald Duck among the rank and file. Docherty wore mirrored sunglasses 247, which seemed out of place here in the dark. But the way they hid his eyes, making his expression unreadable, was very powerful. Sometimes you couldn't tell if Donald Duck was serious against you or just teasing you. "Let's look at your cargo manifest," he said. "That's a hell of a lot of weapons," he continued. "Where are they going?" He lowered his sunglasses to the tip of his nose and simply stared at Dennings. "I think it's going to Iraq, sir," Dennings croaked. "The troops out there need all the firepower they can get," Dennings said in a low voice. "But they won't get it unless you get that damn truck out of this base," said a voice from behind them. "Docherty," said the voice, pronouncing the name so that it sounded almost like the sergeant's hated nickname. "Yes, sir, Lieutenant, sir," shouted Null Docherty, greeting sharply. "Have you noticed who signed the shipping orders on the manifest you hold in your crap hands?" asked the lieutenant. "Yes, sir, noticed, sir," Docherty shouted. "It was General Hammond, sir." "Then why are you bothering the corporal?" "Just doing my job, sir," the sergeant said. "Get that damn truck out of my sight before I make you clean toilets for the rest of your life, Sergeant," the lieutenant said as he walked away. "You heard the lieutenant. Corporal, get out of here," Docherty barked, turning and walking in the opposite direction from where the lieutenant had gone. Dennings jumped into his truck and soon left the base. It's good that the lieutenant intervened for him. They wouldn't want that damn Donald Duck poking around too much with this delivery. Dennings skillfully maneuvered the large truck down the road. A few miles later, he was passed by a charcoal gray Mustang GT, which passed him as if he were standing still. The driver of the car gave him an OK sign when he overtook a slow-moving truck. A few more extracurricular downloads like this, and I'll buy myself a car just like this, Dennings thought. After 20 minutes, Dennings pulled into the highway parking lot. Before the truck stopped, a large Hispanic man whose name was Tito climbed into Dennings' cab. He didn't say a word, just pulled his baseball cap further down over his eyes and leaned his head back on the seat. "Hey, I'm just in time," Dennings said cheerfully. "So what?" said the man in heavily accented English. Dennings drove another 50 miles in complete silence. He pulled into a parking lot on the edge of a national forest park just outside West Virginia and waited. Within 5 minutes, another truck about the same size as Dennings pulled up. Dennings left his truck's engine running and remained in his seat. His passenger got out of the truck and walked to the back. Another man and woman got out of the second truck and joined Dennings' passenger. Suddenly, a car drove up and stopped behind the truck. Dennings could see in the rearview mirror that it was the same Mustang that had passed him on the road more than an hour earlier. The Mustang driver got out. He was about 30 or 40 feet from Dennings' passenger and shouted to him, "Hey, guy, are you sure you can't let me use your phone?" Recognition was instant. Tito's eyes lit up, and he reached for his hidden weapon. But the Mustang driver was faster and shot Tito before he could raise his gun. Both the man and the woman saw Tito fall to his knees. The shot passed through his shoulder and was not fatal, but obviously constituted a serious injury. The man raised his hand, and they noticed that red dots from the laser targeting system appeared on their bodies. They slowly raised their hands and knelt down too. "You should have let me use that phone, kid," the Mustang driver said. Figures in black surrounded both trucks. Dennings stepped on the gas, considering trying to escape. At the sound of him hitting the gas, a rocket launched from behind the trees lit up the sky, exploded, and tore up the ground just 20 feet in front of the truck. Debris from the explosion covered the truck's windshield, scaring Dennings to death. Game over. Dennings raised his hands and jumped out of the truck. He was escorted to a van, where he found himself handcuffed with Tito, 2 men he had been dating, and his lieutenant. Dan Allman sat on the hood of his charcoal gray Mustang GT. He took off his Kevlar vest as he was joined by Arnie Sizemore, his department chief and friend. "Well, this case is closed, and we got them all," Arnie said. "Good job all round," he said. "But your confrontational approach was still a little too cowboyish, Dan. I thought you'd gotten over all that drama by now." "Take the day off tomorrow," he said. "But come to my office for a debriefing when you get back." Arnie," Dan began. "The drive back to Washington will take an hour, even if I drive the way I do." "And what?" said Arnie. "Well, the hospital closes for visiting in 2 hours," Dan said. Arnie sighed and looked down. "Dan," he said quietly, "it's been over 6 months." He paused before continuing. "The doctors did everything they could," he continued. "They saved her life when no one thought it was possible." He paused again to let his words sink in. He knew he was on very thin ice. It didn't matter if he was Dan's boss. Only their friendship allowed him to say what he had already said and live. Dan was one of the most dangerous men alive. "At first, we all thought this might be one of those amazing cases we all read about in first-year psychology," he said. "You know, those cases where an object passes completely through a person's brain and leaves him relatively unharmed." Dan's eyes narrowed slightly. "But Meg is gone," Arnie said quietly. He chose his words very carefully because he really didn't want Dan to lose his temper. "The doctors say she could wake up at any moment," Dan replied sharply. "Okay," Arnie replied sharply. "What if she wakes up and is a plant? Or what if she can't remember you, or can't remember anything at all?" Arnie continued. "Is this really life? And let's say this miracle you're hoping for actually happens. What then?" he asked. "She'll still be a murderer and a traitor," he said sharply. "You divorced her yourself," Arnie said. "In case you forgot, this was the last straw that broke her patience and drove her crazy. She couldn't handle life without you, so she shot another agent and then herself," he said. "So it's better for all of us if she never regains consciousness," he said. "But do as you please," he said, turning to leave. "Dan," he said softly, "I need you to take over the case she was working on when this all happened, if it doesn't hurt you. I'll deliver the files to your office before you return to work the day after tomorrow," he said. A little over an hour later, Dan walked purposefully into the hospital ward at a Washington hospital. He smiled at the nurse behind the counter and pointed to the door. Nurse smiled back and nodded her head. Dan entered the room and looked around. The flowers he ordered just a couple of days ago have already begun to fade. They will have to be replaced. He'll bring new ones when he comes tomorrow. Dan crossed the room and looked at the figure lying on the bed. If he didn't know what they had been through, he would have thought she was just sleeping. He looked at the monitors and saw that she was fine. Over the past 8 weeks, he had learned to interpret her readings almost as well as the medical staff. "Well, we wrapped up my business with the arms dealer today," he told her. "That's why I'm late." "Yes, Meg, I wore my vest, as you always tell me," he said. Dan always spoke to the sleeping woman as if she were awake and listening to him. "Okay, where did we leave off in the book?" he asked, picking up a book from her nightstand. Dan sometimes talked to his wife for hours and also read to her. He massaged her legs, arms, and back, sometimes turning her over to avoid bed sores. Sometimes he sat her down, sometimes he left her lying. He moved her joints every day to prevent muscle atrophy. He brushed her hair daily. Sometimes it seemed as if he alone was pushing a huge stone up the slope. After a month, even her mother started coming only twice a month. She was confident that he or the hospital staff would let her know if her daughter's condition changed. Dan was extremely confident that Meg would pull through. He was never a religious person. He never was. He had seen too many things in his career to believe that any God who was in his right mind would allow people to treat each other this way. So there was only a random chance in his mind. And Meg had a long history of beating the odds. It was almost a miracle that she survived the bullet wound to the head that had brought her here in the first place. Why turn? She died twice on the way to the hospital. It was only luck that she ended up in the hands of such talented and dedicated emergency medics who refused to let her die before she reached the hospital. Then she was on the verge of dying for several days after her surgery to remove bullet fragments remaining in her skull. Even more terrifying for Dan was the first time they took her off the ventilator to see if she could breathe on her own. At first, nothing happened, and Dan couldn't even believe it when he started crying. Doctors warned him that there was a better-than-average chance that Meg would never take another breath. Why should he even care when he was on the verge of divorcing her for cheating on her for almost a year with several different men? But when he looked at that beautiful face, the face he lived with and loved for over 10 years, something had changed. He realized that he could lose her. He actually lost her, but he did not want to lose her in the eternity of death. So it surprised even him when, through tears he didn't even realize he was shedding, he choked out the words, "Damn it, Meg, start breathing right now. I can't do this for you." And then her chest, to the surprise of everyone present, began to rise and fall. Hesitant and irregular at first, but over the next few minutes, the breathing became stronger and more regular. Everyone applauded, and Dan's tears flowed freely. In that moment, he knew he had to put thoughts of everything but her recovery on the back burner. There will be plenty of time for divorce and perhaps further torment once Meg gets back on her feet, or at least regains consciousness. And Dan knew as well as he knew the sun would rise the next morning that Meg would survive it. Meg once told him that her heart beats in response to his. Well, his heart was still beating, so hers should still be beating. About the heartbeat, he said out loud. You're a little higher than you were. Meg, calm down. This book is really good, but it's not so fantastic that it'll give you a heart attack. He read her a book called When We Were Married, which somehow seemed appropriate while reading a divorce story to the woman he was considering divorcing. Meg, how would you like me to finish your last task? He asked. Arnie wants to give it to me. He says there's movement there again, Dan said. I think I'd like to finish it for you. It would almost be like we were working on this last case together, he said. What do you think? He asked, taking her hand. Dan squeezed Meg's hand because it felt different today. Her hand was warmer and her pulse was stronger. Meg, darling, wake up, he said. Dan watched Meg's face carefully, looking for a reaction. Did her right eyelid blink slightly? At that moment, the nurse quietly opened the door and knocked on the wall. Mr. Almond, visiting hours are long over, she said. I let you stay a little longer because you arrived late. Thank you, Dan said, and then Meg added, and you, my girl, I'll be here all day tomorrow. We need to get you through a workout to get you back in shape. The nurse laughed. Like many on this floor, she collected pieces of Meg and Dan's story from various sources until she decided she knew the whole story. Supposedly, Meg cheated on her husband and he decided to divorce her. I even hired a lawyer and prepared documents. He was having lunch with a work colleague when Meg received the documents and she just lost it. She shot the woman Dan was with and then herself before anyone could react. She didn't believe a word of it. First of all, Meg would have to be stupid to cheat on a man as devoted to her as Dan, and she didn't look stupid. Secondly, if you love a man so much that you are willing to kill anyone who is interested in him, and then yourself, why would you cheat on him? It was also obvious that Dan loved his wife beyond measure. Divorce or not, only death could separate these two. "Could you keep an eye on her tonight?" Dan asked. "She's a little warmer than she was, and her heart rate is a little faster." "Mr. Almond, Dr. I have already explained to you that everyone's vital signs change from time to time. It's just her biorhythms," the nurse said. During the drive home, Dan reflected on the events of the past months. First, of course, was his unexpected experience when he saw his wife having sex with her partner. This was the main thing, the beginning of the snowball. Then, of course, there was his revenge on Ray. It was another snowball. Dan used a sniper rifle to literally castrate Ray. Perhaps the strangest thing that happened as a result of Meg's infidelities was that Dan had to arrest the embalmer. While Dan didn't feel responsible for Ray's situation, he did feel horrified by what happened to Kelly. Kelly was smart, beautiful, and headed towards a very bright future. But she made the mistake of trying to stand between two objects that were probably meant to be together. It was like those idiots on TV who make their living by putting their hands in an alligator's mouth, and everyone feels sorry for them when they finally bite. Kelly made the mistake of trying to get between Dan and Meg, and she was bitten by a bullet from the guard's gun, which Meg grabbed. Dan blamed himself because he underestimated his own wife. Often people say things like, "I can't live without my soulmate," or "I'll kill her if she comes near you." But Meg was serious. She really loved her husband so much that she didn't decided to live without him in my life. But she also wasn't going to let anyone else try to take his place and stay alive. So she shot Kelly right in the eye and then shot herself. It all happened so quickly that no one near them could react or prevent it. What seemed completely illogical was that Dan ran, not to Kelly, but to Meg. While everyone else on the scene checked on the supposed victim, Dan's concern was, as always, with Meg. The next day, while Meg was in surgery, Dan just had to leave the hospital. He felt bad for his indifference to Kelly, but he knew she was dead from the moment Meg shot her. He wanted to pay her last respects, but did not feel that he should come to her wake or public farewell to her body. He felt responsible for her death, so he decided to visit her at the funeral home. This way he could say goodbye and apologize to her while she still looked like herself, before it is filled with preservatives to make it look natural. Dan opened the door to the large funeral home and looked around. There seemed to be no one there. He walked from room to room until he realized what he was looking for. Then he noticed that each door had names on it. He searched and found a door marked Yamashita K. Then he quietly opened the door and entered. Inside, Dan saw a small man with very thick glasses and Kelly's body on the laboratory table. The fact that she was naked was not shocking, but the fact that a small man was caressing her right breast with one hand and holding her in his pocket with the other was. All sorts of alarm bells rang in Dan's head, and he cleared his throat loudly. "Oh, you shouldn't be here," the little man said sharply. "Yes, I should," Dan said sharply, towering over the man. Dan showed his ID and saw the little man instantly turn pale. "I'm Agent Dan Almond," Dan said. "I was a colleague of Kelly's and wanted to pay her last respects," he said. "Then you should come back tomorrow or the next day for goodbye," said the little man. "Well, I needed some time with her before all this," Dan said. "I'm pretty sure her family won't be happy to see me." "Then I'll give you a few minutes," said the little man. "But you understand that this is against the rules." Dan simply nodded his head and watched the little man disappear. Dan had a bad feeling about this guy. "Kelly, I'm so sorry about this," Dan began. "We just met, and you didn't deserve this," he continued. "I know it won't change anything for you, but maybe Meg won't make it either," he said. And again, at the thought of Meg dying, Dan began to cry. To be a good field agent, you need an analytical mind. Unlike all the Su-7 movies, where the field agent is a handsome, sexy athlete with the attention span of a dragonfly, who relies on scientists, special gadgets, and analysts at headquarters. A true field agent lives or dies by his ability to constantly analyze and deconstruct his current situation. Dan was used to instantly analyzing everything that happened, and his analysis of his feelings alerted him. He didn't cry because Kelly's life was tragically and needlessly cut short, but because he thought Meg wouldn't make it. Despite everything that had happened, Dan realized that he still loved Meg and would probably love her no matter what. Maybe that's why he told Meg he forgave her. He told her he couldn't trust her anymore, so they couldn't stay married, but he forgave her. When he said this, he was lying, but now he realized that it was true. So what happens if Meg really does miraculously come out of this? Dan still had a bad feeling about the little man who was waiting for him outside the door. The little man was silent as he walked Dan to the door. Dan's apprehension increased when he heard the small man locking the large door behind him. Dan watched through the window as the little man headed back to Kelly's room. Dan calculated the layout of the building and walked around the back, just in time to see the small man approach Kelly's desk. Dan took his iPhone 5 out of his jacket pocket. The phone had a terrible problem with losing connection, but did everything else so well that Dan could live with it. One of the things the phone did well was shooting high-quality HD videos. Dan pulled out a small piece of double-sided tape and taped the phone to the window, starting to record. He looked and saw the little man caressing Kelly's breast again. Dan walked back to the front of the building. He needed to act quickly. As Dan pulled the lock-picking kit out of his pocket, he wished he had another phone to call the local police, but that would have to wait. Inside the autopsy room, the small man finished fondling Kelly's breast. This woman was amazing, he thought. I love my job. Without her, I would never have had the chance to even get close to someone like her. But I had to act quickly. My body was already starting to harden. He pulled down his pants and climbed onto the table. Dan snuck up behind me. Dan knocked him out by hitting him in the back of the head with his weapon. Dan quickly walked around the back of the building and picked up his phone. He then used it to call the police and waited for them to arrive. The agency had a fairly good relationship with the local police, but even then Dan had to explain the situation to the arriving squad. So, you wanted to pay your last respects to the fellow agent your wife shot and killed? Asked the first-floor policeman. Yes, Dan said. That's how it all started. And the Sleeping Beauty here wanted to have sex with a dead man? Asked the second officer. This is fucking sick. You know, when he wakes up, he'll deny it, said the first policeman. Look at the scene, Dan said. Well, his pants are down at the knees, said the second policeman. Damn, this is big, he said, especially for such a small guy. And there is this, Dan said, showing them the video on his phone. The video clearly shows the embalmer climbing on Kelly's naked body. Dan is also seen sneaking up behind him and knocking him out. Damn, they give you iPhones? Said the first policeman. This was the strangest thing that happened as a result of this whole situation. Dan pulled into the driveway of his house and looked at it. Who is he kidding? This place hasn't been home since he found out about Meg's infidelity. It was just a place where he kept his things and slept. He rarely even ate here. Dan took a shower and went to bed to get up early and, like every weekend, spend it at the hospital with Meg. Dan quickly got up and left the house the next morning. He parked his Mustang outside the donut shop, next to the familiar, screaming yellow Mustang, and entered the store. Is the pony still running? Dan asked a familiar face. Every fucking day, the man snorted with a smile. You look in a better mood, Dan said. You can't stay in a bad mood forever, the man said, smiling as he walked towards the table where a stunning young woman was waiting for him. Dan bought a box of donuts and coffee for the nurses at the post. He knew that the better he treated them, the better they would take care of Meg. Perhaps this is not entirely true. Most people in the medical profession truly love helping people feel better, but this couldn't hurt. Dan couldn't get the image of the old man and that girl out of his head. There is a story here, he thought. 20 minutes later, Dan was at the hospital. He left the donuts for the cute nurse behind the counter and went into Meg's room. "Okay, Meg, time for exercise," Dan said. He started by lifting one of her long legs a few inches and bending her knee so it looked like he was forcing her to kick. This was supposed to stimulate the quadriceps muscles and prevent them from atrophying. He did this and several other exercises for her legs. He then literally forced her to do sit-ups to help her abdominal muscles. He always did the arms and shoulders last because he had to be very careful not to damage any feeding tubes or wires to the various monitors. "That's it, Meg. Good training," he said. He squeezed her hand in a gesture of affection, as he had done so many times before she was injured and went into shock. As he squeezed her hand, he felt Meg gently grab his hand and not let go. Her eyes were definitely blinking, not just one eye like last night, but both. And then, in a moment Dan would never forget, she opened her eyes and looked at him. Dan was torn. He didn't want to let her go, but at the same time he needed to tell someone that she was awake. "Dan," Meg croaked. "Help," Dan shouted. "Help." Meg coughed and tried to sit up. Dan was at a loss. He didn't know whether to give her a drink. The nurse who entered the room was so surprised by Meg's open eyes that she almost dropped the board she was carrying. She pressed the panic button, which Dan did not notice, and soon there were many doctors and specialists in the room. "Sir, you will have to wait outside for now," the doctor said. Dan turned to leave and found Meg not letting go of his hand. "Meg, let go," Dan said. "We're in," she started, and then coughed. The doctor closest to her gave her a sip of water. Meg swallowed the water and then looked at Dan. "Are we still married?" she asked. Dan nodded his head. "Then no," she said. "No, what?" Dan asked. "No, I won't let you go," she said firmly. "Meg, we'll have more time later," Dan said. "I don't remember a lot," she said, yawning. "But I know that I did something very bad to you," she continued. "I kept seeing your face and you weren't smiling. So I knew you were mad at me," she continued. "What have I done?" "Meg, I promise I'll be here when they're done with you," Dan said. Meg slowly released his fingers. Dan could tell that she thought if she let him go, he would never come back. Dan left the room so the doctors could check on Meg. He took out his iPhone and called Meg's mom. Meg's mother was a schoolteacher and didn't respond, so he left her a message. "Meg is awake," he said. It was short, concise, and to the point. Dan thought about the second call he needed to make. Should he actually call Arnie, his department head, and let him know that Meg is awake or not? Dan ended up making both calls. He dialed Arnie's number and waited for an answer. "Arnie," Dan said. "Yes, Dan," Arnie's voice answered. He sounded tired, even though it was still early morning. "I have a problem," Dan said. "So I want to ask for advice. Not as my boss, but as a friend." "Okay, speak up, friend," said Arnie. "Hypothetically, what would happen if someone, let's call her Peg, woke up?" Dan asked. "If she woke up and I told my boss, he would have to have agents here around the clock and try to talk to her or arrest her before we even knew if she had brain damage," Dan said. "On the other hand, if I had not spoken up, then I would have been guilty of dereliction of duty or at least obstructing an ongoing investigation." "So what would you do?" Dan asked. "Well, if it were me and I was your boss, hypothetically," Arnie said, "I would need to know when she gets to the point where she can be moved out of the hospital or can leave on her own." He said, "If she is unable to get out of bed, she is not a threat to anyone and is not a flight risk," he continued, "especially if a qualified agent is monitoring the situation." "Thanks, Arnie," Dan said. "Dan," Arnie said, "is there something you want to tell me?" "No," Dan said. "How is she?" asked Arnie. "Well, she doesn't remember much," Dan said, and she just woke up. So I don't know if it's temporary or permanent or if there's brain damage. All I know is that she's awake and smiling. Smiling like an idiot or because she's happy? Asked Arnie. Arnie, remember in sensitivity training, we learned that we don't use words like idiot, Dan said. So why the hell is she smiling? Asked Arnie. I don't know, but I'll keep you posted, Dan said. An hour later, Dan was allowed into Meg's room again. She was washed and her long hair was tied up. Her face lit up when Dan returned to the room. Dan, she said, smiling again. You're back, she said. Dan noticed that she continued to follow him with her eyes wherever he went in the room, as if she was afraid that he would simply disappear. Dan walked over and sat down on the chair next to her bed. She immediately grabbed his hands and kissed them. We're still married, she said. Dan nodded. Meg, how long do you remember? Dan asked her. Pete, first thing I remember is smoke or fog covering everything. I couldn't see anyone or anything, so I didn't know where to go or what to do. I remember sitting down, trying to think, but not knowing what I should think about. I couldn't feel what I was sitting on or anything at all. There were no arms, no legs, nothing. It felt like I was just a floating brain in a fog. Then a thought came to mind. Dan. That was all, just Dan. Great, said the voice in my head. I brought you back for one reason, the voice said. And now you know what she is like, said the voice. I tried to remember all the details of my life up to that moment, and after some time I began to remember. I remembered the first time I saw Dan at the academy. He had already graduated, but returned there to practice at the shooting range. He didn't want to shoot on the range at his new job until he was at least as competent as everyone else there. I watched him work hard, shooting targets from different positions over and over again until he was perfect, and then starting over with a different weapon. He was already recognized as a military sniper, but this was not the same as field pistol shooting. Over the course of a few weeks, we got to know each other better and soon started dating. I didn't fall in love with Dan after a few months of dating. I had already been to him long before our dates. I later learned that the only reason he returned to our training ground after his first visit was to see me. I remembered more. I remember how much he loved serving and protecting the laws and sovereignty of our country. I remember I screwed up a couple of easy assignments during my probationary period as a field agent, and Arnie was going to fire me and my then partner. But Dan intervened and told Arnie that we deserved a second chance. Arnie reluctantly agreed, and I was assigned another assignment as a probationary agent. Then I remembered all the partners, and suddenly it became clear to me what I had done. When I looked at Dan and me, I could see the light coming from us when we were together. It was pure and beautiful light, and my actions turned my part of the light into a dark and disgusting substance. We both needed that light, and a part of me was gone. To make matters worse, I hurt the only person I've ever truly loved. I loved my parents and I loved my pets growing up. But there was only one person for whom I felt adult, true romantic love, and I hurt him deeply. To make matters worse, I flew into a rage because he made it clear to me that he could do something that he thought I had already done. And I killed to make sure no one else would have it. Great, said the voice in my head. I was almost sure that the voice belonged to God or fate or something up there. Have you learned your lesson? Asked the voice. Before I could answer the question, the voice spoke again. Answer my question, and you will be given a second chance. Okay, what's the question? I asked. I really wanted to see Dan again. What did you do wrong? Asked the voice. And what will you do to fix this? He continued. Answer to the first question, I cheated on Dan, I said. What else did you do wrong? Asked the voice. I tried to justify your actions by making up reasons and conditions that didn't make sense, I said. Like it's not cheating because it was only oral, or it's not cheating because I did it for work, I said. What else did you do wrong? Asked the voice. I can't remember anything else, I said. What about killing another person? Asked the voice. Suddenly, I got angry. "That cheap girl tried to grab my Dan," I replied sharply. "Okay, let's move on," the voice said. "If you were allowed to return, what would you change?" he asked me. "I would never cheat on Dan again," I said firmly. "I would spend the rest of our lives together, making him the happiest man on earth." "And?" asked the voice. "Is that all I can do?" I said. "What about murder?" asked the voice. "If that bitch came near Dan, I'd shoot her again," I replied sharply, "with a bigger gun." "Oh, no, that won't do," said the voice. "You can't go back." The next thing I remember was floating in and out of the clouds again, but this time with a sense of déjà vu. I don't know how many times I repeated this same damn conversation, but it always ended the same. I must have repeated this scene 100 times or more. I tried to lie about not shooting Kelly, but it didn't work because the voice told me that lying was a sin. Obviously, he knew what was on my heart or mind. Until finally we had the same conversation. I gave the same damn answer, and the voice just said, "To hell with her. Send her back." Just when I thought, wow, God is cursing, I felt Dan's hand holding mine and knew who he was. I grabbed his hand tightly and didn't let go. I didn't know if the voice allowed me to come back because I would never be able to shoot Kelly again, because I did it too well the first time, or because the voice realized that whatever was trying to come between me and Dan was dead. And so it is. I didn't care because I had a second chance and I wasn't going to ruin it. After Dan left the room, the doctors checked and examined many things. There were some things I remembered about Dan exploring me that I couldn't wait for him to do again. Finally, I looked up, and there he was, back. He came over, looked at me, and I could tell he was happy, just like me. So I started smiling because Dan was happy to see me. He came and sat next to me, and I grabbed his hand. "Meg, how long do you remember?" he asked me. And I told him everything. I cried so much while we were talking that I thought I would run out of tears. I told him how much I wanted to die for what I did and all the stupid reasons why I did it. I told him how much I still loved him and how I didn't care that I was fired. I told him that in the end, the only thing I wanted was to be with him in any way he chose. And as I looked at him, he whispered two things to me. "Meg, I love you too. Now I understand that I can never stop loving you," he said. The second thing he whispered to me, "From now on, when someone asks you something, you don't remember anything. Meg, if people walk into a room that you've known your whole life, you don't remember them," he told me. "You don't remember the little things," he continued. "You can tie your right shoe," he told me, "but not the left one. When you get dressed, wear your bra over your t-shirt," he said. He gave me a whole list of things I had to remember not to remember, like what I can read but can't write. I could only remember part of the alphabet and only some numbers. When I met people, I had to remember that I didn't remember them. It was difficult, and we practiced a lot over the next few days. When my mother came to visit me and I knew we were being monitored by psychologists, I pretended I didn't remember her. And the next few times she came, I always forgot who she was until the 5th or 6th visit. Then she became the woman from last week who visited me. I know it was hard for my mom, but being in prison wouldn't have been any easier for her, and it certainly wouldn't have been any worse for me. It was easier to see people from the agency. When Arnie came to visit me for the first time, I even convinced him that I didn't remember him. He was one cunning son of a dog, but he almost caught me. I started walking a few days before his visit, and he took me for a walk around the hospital. He talked to me as we walked, and before I knew it, he was letting me lead us around the hospital, talking to me at the same time. He asked me questions about things I claimed I didn't remember, and then I noticed he was watching me and where I was taking us. I walked past my room and continued walking, starting to look worried, and then just sat down on the floor. I thought about how I would never see Dan again, and I just started crying. Arnie, of course, thought it was because I was upset that we were lost. "Meg, we're not lost," he said. "I can take us back to your room." Dan, I said. Dan has to find us. He won't know where we are. I started crying again, and Arnie was alarmed and called for help. The agency's top psychologists told him that my brain was essentially a mess. I could remember fragments of things, but the memories were incomplete and the synaptic connections did not connect. There was also likely severe damage to the connections between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. This is why I not only had trouble remembering some things, but even processing some basic things. What bothered them the most was the thing with Dan's shoes. The ability to tie one shoe, but not the other, left them perplexed. They also told Arnie that I would probably maintain my childlike, happy state for a long time, if not my entire life. Essentially, I was unable to function at a higher level and needed constant care, possibly for the rest of my life. I was not a danger, and with the right support, I could have lived a normal life, but I was unable to work or do work. Perhaps with a lot of patience, I could learn to do some self-care tasks, but it wouldn't be sustainable. Like maybe I could learn to wash dishes, but not wash clothes. It would take a lot of time and effort, but it was possible. "Is she competent to stand trial?" asked Arnie. "For what?" asked the doctor. "She has very few memories of anything before she woke up 3 weeks ago." Dan, of course, came to me and was with me every day. I lived for his visits. They were my reward for all the lies and deceit. Now I understood what he was forcing me to do. If they thought I had brain damage, I would have avoided life in federal prison. But I would rather spend the rest of my life in prison and receive visits from Dan than be free and not have him in my life, so I needed to ask him about his intentions. There was also the problem that as my body regained strength, my reproductive system and genitals also returned to normal. Every time I saw Dan, I wanted to get him into bed with me. I wanted this so badly that I started taking his hands and moving them over my body. One time, when Dan entered the room, I didn't notice that Arnie and one of the psychiatrists were following him. I grabbed Dan's hand and stuck it between my legs while Dan tried to pull it out without hurting me. He blushed with embarrassment, but the psychiatrist told him not to be shy. After all, she is a grown woman. Her mind may not be fully competent, but her body is fine, the doctor said. She has her own needs, and technically you are her husband, he continued. You need to understand your own feelings for her before someone else takes advantage of her vulnerability, he said. Dan just looked shocked. Arnie turned away because he remembered our story. Dan, said the psychologist, you were one of the main reasons she came out of it with some semblance of her sanity intact. You've been here with her every day since the injury, he continued. You read to her and talked to her and massaged her body. And you just took care of her, he said. You wouldn't do that for someone if you didn't feel something. You need to decide what you want to do, he said. I recommend to my superiors, based on her current mental state and her previous service to the country, not to press charges or prosecute her legally. The problem is that we are spending much less on caring for ex-soldiers or intelligence officers than we used to, he said. She has fully recovered from the physical aspects of her injury, so unless someone comes to care for her, she will likely be released into the care of the state and transferred to a state care facility. Both the doctor and Arnie looked at Dan. Arnie spoke first. Dan, it hurts me to see her like this, he said. She was never my best agent, but she had the potential to be great, he continued. She was smart and talented, and now it's all lost, he said, as if I wasn't standing there. But if you still have feelings for her, I can pull a few strings to help get her into your care and even help where I can so you can get help caring for her while you work. But that depends on you, he said. I need a few days to think about it, Dan said. I need to accurately define my feelings TVA. I'm not sure if I love her despite what happened between us, or if what I feel is just guilt, because in a way I feel responsible. If it's just guilt, then maybe the best thing for me to do is just back off, he said. I'm not sure it's in the patient's best interest, the doctor said. You seem to be her anchor. You pulled her out of her coma. Damn man, you were married to her for 10 damn years, he said. Doesn't all of that outweigh the few misdeeds she doesn't even remember? Then the door creaked open and Ray walked in. His gait was very stiff, and I noticed that his earlier confidence was gone. He has aged 20 years in the 10 months since I last saw him. He walked up to me, walking around Dan and Arnie. I gave him one of my brightest and biggest smiles. "Are you the new doctor?" I asked in a childish voice. "Meg, don't you recognize me?" he asked seriously. "No, she won't find out. Now get out of here," Dan said coldly, "and don't come back again." Even Arnie was surprised by the cruelty of Dan's words towards Ray. "For what it's worth, I'm truly sorry," Ray began. "I'm more sorry than you will ever understand. For what it's worth, next time I see you, I'll make whoever shot you look like he did you a favor," Dan said. "Dan, calm down," Arnie said. "You may not threaten other agents under any circumstances." "Actually, I think it's a good sign," the doctor said. "If he didn't have feelings for her, he wouldn't be so angry," he said. "Why don't you take a few days to explore your feelings for your wife, Agent Almond?" the doctor said. Then he and Arnie left and Dan and I were left alone. Dan walked around the room and made sure that there were no bugs installed in it, as he usually did. "Would you like to go for a walk, Meg?" he asked loudly, as if someone was listening to us. We walked out of the hospital into a park-like area at the back. "Dan, I'm not going to jail," I said happily. "I know," he said. "You did a great job. You fooled everyone." "You'll still have to be careful from time to time," he said. "But in a few years, everyone will have forgotten about all this, and you will be just another name on the list of government pension recipients. You'll be able to lead a relatively normal life," he said. I started crying and Dan wiped my tears away. "What's wrong, Meg?" he asked. "I don't want a relatively normal life," I said. "I don't want you to divorce me." "Dan, I know I messed up, but I love you so much. I would do anything for another chance for us. Without you in my life, none of this matters," I said. "If you leave me, I might as well go and tell Arnie that I shot that bitch, and I'd do it again. Dan, you belong to me. I will never let anything come between us." "Meg, I thought you were going to die," Dan said. "But somewhere deep down, I just knew that you would wake up again." "I love you too, more than I can express in words," he said. "So if you really want, I would also like to give us another chance." "That's all I want most." "Dan," I said. "Do you understand that you will no longer be able to work?" he asked. "I don't care about that," I said. "As soon as you're ready, we can start having kids." "I'm ready now," he said with a grin. At that moment, I realized that everything would be fine with us. "So, Dan, do you still love me?" I asked. "Yes, Meg," he said, much like the old Dan. "I think I love you more," I said. "I shot that bitch because she tried to get between us." "I think I love you just as much," he said. "I won't let anything come between us either." End. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.